Welcome to the For Love and Money podcast, the show where business and social purpose meet to inspire a movement for positive change. Here's your host, Carolyn Butler-Madden.
I'm recording today from Guyamaigal and Garigal country, and I want to begin by honouring the elders past, present and emerging of these lands. Their deep wisdom, their relationship with country and their enduring stewardship remind me often of what it means to lead with purpose over generations. In research conducted with 200 global leaders across 2022 and 2023, my guest today found that only 1 in 3 said they were doing their best work. But here's the twist. When she dug deeper, even the ones who said yes turned out to be constrained in almost exactly the same ways as everyone else. Stuck, stifled, held back by bureaucracy, the absence of clear purpose, and conditions that weren't built for how people actually do their best work. That finding sits at the heart of everything Cherie Mylordis does. Cherie is a leadership, innovation, and future of work expert, and she's been finding herself at the leading edge of change her entire career. She was among the first to put her hand up when Accenture launched its change management services practice in the early days. She was team member number 52 at what became a workforce of 1,500 plus 50,000 volunteers and 100,000 contractors, helping to build and deliver the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games from the inside. And when she returned to the corporate world after that experience, she couldn't unsee what she'd seen. How much human potential gets left on the table when organisations default to hierarchy, rigidity, and fear over purpose, autonomy, and trust. That restlessness is what led her to found NextGenify and NextGenify Academy, where she works with leaders at all levels to challenge outdated ways of working and create the conditions for people and organisations to truly thrive. Cherie's framework for this is called Work in 3D. And in this conversation, we get into what that actually means. Dare, ditch and dial, and why the middle D is the one most organisations are still missing. This is a conversation about what's possible when purpose ignites people. I hope you love it as much as I did. Here's my conversation with Cherie Mylordis. Cherie, welcome to the For Love and Money podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Carolyn, and hello to your listeners.
Let's get right into it. Do you think there's a role for love in business?
I do. I think love...
Thought you might.
Yes, absolutely. I really do. I think love in business shows up as care, it shows up as courage, and it shows up to a commitment to both purpose and the people. So it really is about creating the conditions for people to do their best work so that the business can deliver really amazing outcomes that have a purpose underneath it.
And that seems to be a common theme in the work as we've sat down and chatted and had a coffee, and the research I've done on you, that common theme seems to be unlocking the best in people. So that makes a lot of sense. So Cherie, I would love you to share with our listeners your story, your backstory. What has brought you, what are the key moments in your life that have brought you to where you are today?
Oh, I love this question. And, it's hard to know where to start, but I think there's a key piece to my upbringing that has, in hindsight, sparked a lot about who I am and how I show up. And that is that I'm the first in my family to go to university on both sides. And I come from a family and an extended family where people more worked in the trades or in more blue-collar roles. And so being more academically inclined and wanting to go to university meant that I was really breaking new ground from a family perspective. And I didn't have any role models. I didn't have anyone to mentor me or guide me. And what that meant was I became a conscious curator. I had to have my antenna up all the time and notice what was going on around me and pick and choose what I liked, what I didn't like. And that formed my approach because that's really all I could do, right? And I think that has stayed with me through my entire career, really consciously observing, critiquing, and curating things so that I come up with this blended set of tools, techniques, and elements that inform how I show up. Yeah, so that's really what I think a starting point. From studying university, I studied computer science. I knew that I wouldn't go into a deeply technical role, but I felt like it was a stepping stone to something valuable and something that would be relevant in the work perspective. So I did that, and that gave me a stepping stone into consulting. So I started with Accenture and worked in the information consulting division in the Brisbane office of Accenture. And then about a year and a half in, a new practice line emerged called Change Management Services. And it was a new global practice line because Accenture had been exploring this area of organizational change with some academics. And they felt that that was the missing piece in driving major technological change. So I put my hand up and said, I think that sounds like a perfect fit for me. It was that blend of understanding technology and then relating it and applying it to the transition that the organization and the people need to go through. So I think that was another really defining moment in my career, and a pattern of finding myself at the forefront of new things. So sometimes by good luck and sometimes by good management, finding myself at the cusp of things. So I was at the very leading edge of change management. And then moving from there, I ended up at the leading edge of agile transformations and design thinking and more innovative ways of empowering internal teams to think like entrepreneurs and have the permission to apply new ideas. And in the mix of that, a major career defining moment was working for the Sydney Olympics. So I was in the strategy team number 52 of an eventual workforce of 1,500,
Wow.
plus the 50,000 volunteers and the 100,000 contractors. So really there from the beginning, it was an amazing 5-year experience that changed how I think about leadership and work, because we had that bold purpose. We were handed a very strong purpose of bringing the athletes of the world together. But in order to deliver this enormous event with a fixed deadline in the eyes of the world looking at us, we were given permission to figure it out. We were all Olympic rookies. We were smart. We had that consulting ethos of being curious and problem solving and figuring things out. And what that led to was quite a radical way of working when I look back on it. We had radical autonomy. We had a lot of permission to collaborate and use our initiative towards that bold purpose and towards those incremental milestones along the way that led us to the big event. So I think all of those elements have come together and shaped my outlook on life and on work, and why I feel so strongly about purpose underpinning everything, as well as more contemporary ways of leading and working that really has autonomy and collaboration rather than that more traditional hierarchical way of getting work done.
And that theme comes through so clearly. You talk about your upbringing and how it launched you into being a conscious curator, and finding yourself at the leading edge of change management, design thinking, being given permission at the Sydney Olympics to explore how you did things.
Yes.
It doesn't sound to me like that was accidental. Do you think, like, given what you've described, it sounds, as an observer, I would say people recognize in you the ability to lead, to truly lead, not to follow a set of rules or a framework, but to figure it out and apply.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I think that is what comes through when I tell this story. Yet I was very shy. I, felt like I was often out of my depth, and, sometimes I felt like I didn't belong. And so I think it was sort of wrestling with the tension of feeling out of my depth, feeling a little bit inadequate, but also every single time I was putting myself out of my comfort zone and I was figuring it out and I was achieving things. So I think it's that tension, and not feeling like you're always on top of it does keep you humble. It keeps you curious. It keeps you wanting to learn and grow from everything around you. And so, yeah, I guess that is true, but I think it is that those two elements that have come together, and they both stay with me. It's not taking anything for granted and never feeling like I've really always figured it out, if that makes sense.
Which is great, because it means
Yeah.
you are on your toes and you're constantly looking at, how do we do this better and how do we provide the proof points that this is working? So, really interesting. So you talked about the Sydney 2000 Olympics, and those Olympics, I mean, it was amazing to experience them. And they have been described as the best games ever. What did that experience teach you about what people are truly capable of? When it means something to them.
I think people are capable of absolutely extraordinary things when they are ignited by a meaningful purpose or goal. And it could be something that feels almost impossible, but it's worth striving for. And when that happens, it ignites this passion and this intrinsic motivation that you can't get any other way, I think. And so, we were so proud and so excited about this opportunity. And there was also a lot of, cynical media footage, and, the media always wants to post all the bad stuff, right? So there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of protocols. Everyone wants a piece of the Olympics. So we had to grapple with all of that. And I think that made us even more determined to pull it off. So, yeah, I think it really is extraordinary, and it's surprising what people are capable of when they have that ignition of a bold purpose, but when they also have air cover, support, guidance, so they don't feel like it's completely beyond their reach. They're not, jumping off a cliff. That it's beyond the end of their fingertips, I think is important. So it's not too scary. But I think people achieve beyond what they even themselves think is possible when those conditions are in place. And I have seen that time and time again.
It's a fascinating case study, and it takes me back to the Sydney Olympics and an article I read about it afterwards, which made so much sense to me. And because I remember before, in the months lead up to it, several months before, people, just ordinary people, were talking about it with such cynicism.
Yes.
Right? And it was suddenly in the 2 weeks prior where something shifted.
Yes.
And this excitement kicked in, and Sydney changed. People changed, and people were lovely. People were letting you into a car space and giving you money, when you were short of change, like incredible things. And I read an article that made sense of it for me. And it goes to what you're talking about, I think, because it said, maybe Australians, perhaps there was fear that we were going to screw this thing up on the world stage, and we were going to look like lemons. And that cynicism played out as people were, talking about it negatively. And then as, the ordinary people amongst us started seeing things working, it gave us confidence to believe. Ted Lasso, right? To believe.
To believe, that's right. And it brought out the best of us. We were really at our best. And the weather was so kind to us as well, which was really fortunate.
Yeah, that was on point. And that's it. It's the best of us. And that's the whole purpose piece, isn't it? When there's that higher purpose that is ignited from within, from inside out, it doesn't just impact the people in the organisation. it starts to spread out to all stakeholders. So it is super, super powerful. So
It is. And, it's only 6 years until Brisbane 2032, which is not just Brisbane, it's the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, even other regions like the Whitsundays are hosting the sailing. And so I think it's so important for them to see this opportunity, not just for the function and the organisations that are directly involved, but for everyone in Queensland. It's that opportunity to bring out the best of us when you've got this exciting goal that we're all striving for. And I think every organisation could find elements that might show how they show up in these 6 years and how they bring out the best of themselves for that milestone and beyond. So it's a wonderful opportunity for Brisbane to even take things further than Sydney did.
A huge opportunity. But I think the message from it goes further than that, Cherie. I think it goes to every organisation and the potential there is to unlock within the organisation. And on the negative side, you start thinking how much is being left on the table.
Yes.
When you're not tapping into that. And that's
Absolutely.
the exciting bit.
Yes. And that's actually what happened when I left the Olympics and went back into the corporate world. I felt unsettled because I was working in a more traditional hierarchy, more rigid job description. And I felt that the people that I was working with also were undervalued and unfulfilled at work. And they couldn't see any pathway out of it. They didn't know what the answer was. But it just really sat with me. It really became clear to me that we were stifling people. We were stifling potential. And that was impacting not just those people, but the organisations as a whole. And so, yes, there is an opportunity well beyond the Olympics to unlock that potential and create these conditions that are good for everyone.
What are the signs? So when you finished at SOCOG and went out into the corporate world, so what are the signs that you read that made you start thinking, this is not working?
One of them is the hierarchy. So, it's about status and working your way up that ladder to the level where you have the power and the authority to make decisions and drive the strategy. And that is the traditional approach, right? Where you have to climb that ladder and get to those higher echelons when you feel like you have a high status position and you have the power. What I see in organizations that flip that, because as a result of the Olympics, I started to be, again, a conscious curator and look for, well, where is it different? Are there any organizations around the world that are not stuck in that more traditional hierarchy? And I found lots of them. And what they do differently, so those signs are, they've got that not radical, they've got a bold and inspiring and audacious purpose. They all have that. They also have a lot of autonomy. They have less layers. And the decision-making is often at the level where the information is. So rather than having to feed things up the hierarchy and wait for the important people at the top to make the decisions and then come down again, they empower people to make appropriate decisions based on the knowledge and their role. So it's a lot flatter. It's a lot more autonomous. People are empowered, and there's also a lot more transparency. And in many cases, it's quite surprising the things that are transparent. In some cases, salaries are transparent, even, decision-making. So things are unlocked as a default rather than locked as a default is what I see. And so transparency and autonomy balance each other out. So when you're giving someone that autonomy to make those decisions, use their initiative, when it's transparent, then it's there for everyone to see. And so that is a balancing factor towards people doing crazy things, right?
Crazy good things.
Yeah. So when it's transparent, they do crazy good things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you, as you say, you went on to lead transformation across some of the world, some big companies. And I read that you did a research project with 200 global leaders. When did you do that project?
I did 2 consecutive studies in 2022 and 2023.
Okay.
Mm.
And you found that only 1 in 3 leaders felt they were doing their best work. Is that right?
I did. And it got even worse than that, Carolyn,
Oh, really?
because, yeah, so my first question to these leaders across different industries and different roles was, are you currently doing your best work? And one third answered yes. So one third said they were, 2/3 said sometimes or not at all.
Wow.
However, when I unpacked that further and asked them more questions, there were 8 questions that I asked them all. What I learned was that the people that said they were doing their best work had answered that way because they were good at what they do. So they felt like, yeah, I'm at the top of my game. I'm really good at leading X. So I'm doing my best work. But in response to subsequent questions, it actually revealed that they were also constrained in very similar ways to the people that said sometimes or no. So the things that were constraining them were the lack of clear strategic direction or purpose. The second one, which was the biggest, was the bureaucracy, the culture and the conditions that weren't enabling them to do their best work. They were stuck and stifled. And then the third reason was that their thresholds for what they were prepared to tolerate at work had changed. And COVID had really shone a light on that. So that work-life balance, in some cases, toxic workplace cultures, they were prepared to trade off salary and status for better conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And something that they felt, resonated with what they wanted out of work and life. Now, I think that's shifted a bit lately because there's a lot of fear in work in terms of the changes that are happening in AI and threat of people losing their jobs. So I think people are putting their head down and hanging on for dear life at the moment.
Yeah.
And not necessarily prepared to be as assertive about these conditions that they're looking for. So I think that has shifted in the last year or so.
Yeah, okay. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because that clearly suggests that so much value is being left on the table by
Yes.
leaders as well as by their teams.
Yeah.
And whilst people are pulling their heads in now because of fear,
Mm-hmm.
the conditions of the environment dictates that we need to be agile, seeking opportunities, innovative, like all the things that you would expect when people are feeling like they can fulfill their best version of themselves.
And valuing those human skills that technology can't replace. So, again, linking to purpose, but new ideas. The AI can only draw on what's already been done. The LLMs are data sets, and it's looking at predictive responses, right, based on what they've already got access to. But creativity, empathy, problem solving, critical thinking, there's a lot of skills that are uniquely human that we really need to honour and embrace in our people.
And so that's what has led you to creating NextGenify and NextGenify Academy. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So NextGenify is the consulting coaching business. So I work with executives and I work with leaders to help them be more future fit in the way they lead and in the way they work. So it's a lot of coaching, and the typical leaders I work with, it seems to be that they're at the verge of taking on a bigger transformational role. And so it's making sure that they can show up as a good leader in this environment of complex change or transformation. So it's at the intersection of those two things that I think is one of my sweet spots, and helping them show up with that clarity of purpose, bringing more autonomy, bringing more collaboration into the way they lead and the way they work. Things like that is where I tend to support leaders in that coaching role. I also work with organizations to help them define their purpose and then cascade that, because that's helping to ignite that intrinsic motivation in their people and giving them permission and autonomy towards that. So sometimes there's a gap there. And it's also in the area of change, because as you've heard, that's where my career started, really, in that area of change management. And so one of the areas that I tend to work closely with organizations on is getting a very compelling change narrative that tells the story, because every organization is trying to get as much change as possible in from all sorts of different reasons. They're upgrading technology, they're bringing in new technology, they're improving their customer experience, they're making their workforce experience better. There's usually at least 20 to 50 major projects that they're trying to get out and implement. And there's a frustration in the traction of getting these changes out because of the capacity of the workforce to absorb them. And so if you have a compelling narrative that connects everything back to purpose and clusters everything into core themes, it makes it a better story to tell. And it actually helps leaders create the pull towards the change rather than feeling like they're pushing change out and meeting with that resistance. So Next Genify is about looking at purpose as an enabler for future-focused leadership and change. And then on the Next Genify Academy side, the reason for that is because of my career, I guess I've worked at the intersection of these, leading edge and future-focused disciplines. And I've had to figure this out through an organic method. And I know that when I coach leaders, I can help them achieve extraordinary outcomes, but that's not accessible to many people. It's not accessible to many leaders, and it's certainly not accessible to emerging leaders or ambitious professionals. So I wanted to create a platform where I could make that available in a more accessible and scalable way. And not just online courses, but access to proven tools and also scenarios that people might be facing where they're not quite sure how to tackle it. And then I might curate those tools. Coming back to my curation superpower, I guess, these are some tools that I would suggest that you try if you're dealing with this situation. So that's what the Academy is. It's to enable ambitious professionals at any level to lead forward in a way that is backed by this sort of coaching ethos and this guidance. And it can be used by individuals, but it can also be applied by teams or by leadership groups to apply it to a specific initiative or challenge. So it's a way to enable a more innovative approach to solving a problem or achieving an outcome.
Before we dive back in, a quick word from me. If you're enjoying this conversation, you might want to know that I work with leaders and organisations on how purpose becomes a powerful driver of trust, performance and resilience. I speak at leadership conferences and company events about how purpose shows up where it matters most, in leadership, in culture and in strategy, helping organisations grow with clarity and confidence in a changing world. You can find out more at my website, carolynbutlermadden.com. Now, back to the episode. I love that. And it's a program or a course they can work through in their own time?
Yes. So there's multiple online programs. Currently, there's 22 tools in there, and there are 7 scenarios. And then there are feature stories that show examples of real transformation in action and the outcomes. And I'm always looking to the community to feed to me, well, here's a scenario that I'd love you put inside the Academy, or here's a story that shows the learning. So making it two-way and really embracing what the community is and meeting them where they are to make it current.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you have a work in 3D framework, which I would love you to share with us.
I would love to tell you about this because I think it really underpins my whole ethos now about work. So where this came from, Carolyn, is after the Olympics, as I mentioned, I became really fascinated with finding organisations around the world that were leading and working in a more progressive way. And I found lots of them in different industries, different countries. And what I discovered was they had 3 traits in common. And they all start with D. And that's why I've come up with the term work in 3D. I say these extraordinary organisations work in 3D. And the 3 Ds are they dare. So they dare to go after a bold purpose that might almost seem impossible, but it's worth striving for. They ditch. So they are open to discarding work practices or ways of working that no longer serve them. So what's slowing them down? What's holding them back from that purpose? It might be something that that seemed like a good idea at some point, but now it's not needed. There are other ways. So they're prepared to ditch, and they're prepared to give their people permission to suggest what could be ditched. And then the third D is for dial. So they're prepared to dial up more contemporary, more future-focused ways of leading and working that bring out the best in their people and are good for business as well. So I found that these organizations all did those three things. And so it's a catchy way to illuminate what does good leadership and what does good work look like. And if organizations were able to show that they are prepared to work in 3D and here's how they work in 3D, that would be very compelling for people seeking career opportunities, or if they're feeling like they're not contributing value where they're currently working. Well, how might I find an organization that is an organization that would align with my values and give me good opportunities and have the opportunity to do more meaningful work? So it really comes down to those three things. And what I hear often when I talk about this is people say to me, the purpose makes sense and the dialing up makes sense, but the ditch is often missed. So there's always that expectation to add new things and do things new ways, but not to create the space to go, well, what can we actually ditch to free up more space to do things better?
So does that model come through your Next Gen Academy?
Mm-hmm. It comes through everything.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think you would have just spoken to a whole generation of Gen Z people who would be like, yes, bring
Absolutely.
it on, bring it on.
Yes. And this relates to the term conscious unbossing, which is this catchy phrase that has emerged out of some research that was done in the UK recently, where thousands of people were researched about how they feel about work. And it turned out that that Gen Z demographic said, I don't want to be a boss. I can see what my boss does and other bosses that I know do, and that doesn't motivate me. That doesn't inspire me. And so out of that, this term came out, which was conscious unbossing. And what it meant was that Gen Z is saying, well, I want a more flexible career path. I might want to become an expert in something without necessarily having to then move into managing people doing the thing that I'm an expert in. I might want to just become a specialist. I might want to take a side hustle or go traveling. So that lattice career appeals to Gen Z, as opposed to the ladder where you're coming in at the bottom and you're just going straight up. They want more flexibility, and they certainly want meaningful work that does feel like it's aligned to a purpose.
Yeah.
And so that really resonates with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that unbossing, I love that term, because even the word boss, it feels like I'm up here, you're there, I'll tell you what to do.
Yes.
When you see the best, the most successful companies who are driven by a higher purpose, their leaders stepping aside and making way for people and nurturing them and helping lift them up, rather than going,
That's right. Totally. I always cringe when someone introduces me as their boss. I always have. I just like, please don't call me your boss. I don't want to boss you around.
Yeah, same.
And so I was so excited when this term came up. I was like, I wish I'd come up with that term.
I love it. I thought you had come up with it. But
I actually have not been able to find the person that invented it. I can trace the research where it evolved, but the actual person that came up with the term, I'm really keen to know.
Yeah, right.
Who did that.
I think I might go down that rabbit hole. I love the it really describes it very clearly. So, Cherie, when we met, you shared a story about your involvement in a program where you went to, I'm not going to mention the company's name, that's up to you whether you can or can't, but that story about the experience you went through working with them, I would love if you could share that with us, because it was so inspiring.
Look, I can share some details about the organisation, not too much detail, but there are details that have been publicly shared. So I can tell you that it was Siemens Energy. And Siemens Energy have run a number of these innovation sprints. So it comes from the world of what's called exponential organizations. There's a fantastic book written by Salim Ismail that sparked this this technique of running, I guess you'd call them innovation boot camps, where they're looking at these 11 attributes of the world's fastest growing organizations and taking legacy organizations through a process by empowering teams to approach a problem in a really innovative way and getting them to pitch ideas. So a little bit like a startup pitching to a VC, but this happens internally. And so Siemens Energy had run about 5 of these. I'm an accredited coach in this technique, and so I can be approached at any time to work on one of these sprints. Now, I hadn't worked on the first number of sprints, but I was approached on this one because it had an Asia-Pacific focus. And so it was 10 countries where there were Siemens Energy offices and services being delivered through the Asia-Pacific region. They invited professionals within those areas to express interest in being involved in the next sprint. And 3 times the amount of people that they could take expressed interest. They went through this selection process where they had to pitch why they wanted to be involved. And then 6 teams were formed with 7 participants each. And I was coaching one of those teams. So of the 6 teams, there were 3 themes. So 2 teams worked on a particular thing. And my team was focusing on accelerating decarbonisation with an initial focus on China, but with initiatives that were scalable and applicable to go global. And that was where I thought, I think I've met my match. I've talked about getting out of my comfort zone and going after new things, but I thought, that's what the whole world wants. How could I possibly, in 3 months, help a team come up with something that will accelerate decarbonisation? So it was very daunting. But we had our first week of the sort of team building and shock and awe and shifting their mindsets in Shanghai. And I remember my team saying to me, we don't know why we're here. There's all these initiatives already on the list in our innovation labs in Shenzhen, in Berlin, and in America. What could we possibly come up with that they haven't? And I said to them, trust the process. Just trust me and trust the process. And the outcome was an extraordinary idea that would change the way aluminium smelting was done to enable green energy to be used. And it involved a partnership with a startup in New Zealand. And last year, I received an email from an executive in Siemens Energy to say that the New Zealand Prime Minister was visiting Shanghai and would be there to observe the signing of the cooperation agreement between Siemens Energy and NPOT, the startup in New Zealand that had invented some technology that would help with the tolerance of green energy and getting the consistent heat that was needed when you are smelting aluminium. So it was about configuring some internal capability within Siemens Energy with what this startup had come up with, bringing that together, and that came that solution that the team had configured resulted in this extraordinary initiative that is now being implemented.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And when you shared this story with me, and we had longer than unfortunately we have on the podcast to go through it, but you took me through just the transformation you saw happening in people in the team, and
yes.
that I'd love you to talk to that a bit, because that's the bit that I found. So, I mean, the outcome is incredible, but it wouldn't have happened without that transformation of the people,
Absolutely.
who you were leading there.
Yes. And that's why people say that this sprint experience, which is sort of 10 to 12 weeks, they felt like it was better than an MBA, because it was real world learning, applying these progressive tools and techniques to a real situation that was about learning and fast feedback in real time. And so, yes, the start was these people had expressed interest and they had got through that selection process, and it was a cross-functional team. It wasn't an intact team that I was coaching, so they had never worked together before. So that was the first thing. Team members that had not worked together before. So you've got that tension. You're dealing with a coach from a different culture, different background, who you've never worked with before, who is external to your organization. You've got this feeling that what could we possibly come up with that hasn't already been thought about? And so with all of that, and then that sort of shock and awe, the presentations that we delivered in that first week to lift the energy and start them thinking differently with some well-designed activities, that was the start to go, well, okay, this is exciting. Yes, it's a bit scary and daunting, but let's go on the journey together. So starting to build that trust. But then what happens throughout that process of weekly assignments, you get to what I call the messy middle. So it all just feels overwhelming and daunting and too hard. And by the middle, the teams need to have 4 pretty clear ideas of a problem and a solution and a bit of detail on what that might involve. That is pitched to a Shark Tank style environment. And then as a result of the feedback, they are required to choose 2. So no one makes the decision for them. They have to decide which 2 are we going to pick. And I can never tell them what to do. I'm their coach. I can point things out, but it's always their decision. So they pick 2. And then for the second half, they are really developing further detail, and they are testing and exploring these 2 ideas to get to a point where they can pitch a really powerful initiative that they're hoping to seek funding and approval for from their executives. And so this messy middle, I remember feeling like we've got nothing. We'll be one of the teams that has learnt a lot because they only wanted to pick 3 out of the 12 initiatives. So 6 teams with 2 ideas, they only wanted to pick 3. And I remember feeling in the middle, we're going to be one of those teams that's had amazing learnings, and there'll be a cultural shift when they go back to their substantive roles, but we're not going to be one of the 3. And then at the end of it, I think my team got the highest scores of any of the initiatives. And so it's just trusting the process, holding space during that messy middle, and somehow magic seems to happen as you're coming out of that. I'm not quite sure how, but things just start to gel, and it's just that constant critiquing and what about this? Have you thought about that? Go talk to more people, test it out, and just doing as much as you can out of the building, not just staying within your bubble of your team. And somehow things come out of it and it starts to take shape. And often it's in the final days that it really starts to take shape. Adrenaline kicks in, they're getting ready for those big presentations, and every team delivered extraordinary initiatives, and the executive actually backed more than 3.
Wow.
So the value to them was really clear on what it had achieved, both in terms of that personal transformation, as you mentioned, as well as the business initiatives that they wanted to take forward.
That must have been so fulfilling for you to observe and to be party to watching the team and the individuals grow in stature, like just grow out of that process.
Absolutely. And they said to me at the end, "You're like our mother, but in a good way." I wasn't sure exactly what they meant, but I think it is like I am nurturing. And so I'm kind and I'm nurturing, and I bring that coaching ethos, but I also do point out to them where I feel like they might be steering off in the wrong direction, and maybe, lean into this a bit more. So trying to guide them without really telling them what to do, giving them that autonomy. But also being able to give them frank feedback as well. And that's in their interests. I remember in a previous similar project, there was a team of very smart engineers and analysts. It was in the mining sector in Australia. And there was a woman on my team who was very smart. She was an engineer and incredibly capable. But whenever she shared her thoughts, she would always end it by saying, perhaps we can consider A, B, and C. Just a thought, or I'm not sure. And so she would almost derail herself at the end by adding this piece of uncertainty. And I actually had a one-on-one chat with her, and I said to her, look, I'm not sure if you're aware that you're doing this. It is something that I see more in women than in men, where they kind of hold themselves back a little bit. And I said, whenever you have something to say, it's always worth listening to. She was more of an introvert, so she was a thinker. And so when she did speak, there was some deep thought behind what she wanted to say. And so I coached her on that, and I said, just pause when you get to the end of what you're going to say, and don't say that end bit. Try not to say that end bit. And she did that, and it just created an enormous shift in terms of how she was received by the rest of the team, which was there was only one other woman in the team. And the other thing that happened in the end was she was the one that did the final presentation.
Yeah, right.
And with the sprints I usually, with any project I do of that nature, I usually rotate who is the team coordinator for the week and who's going to present for the week, because typically there's a weekly presentation where you're sharing your findings and your progress and you're seeking feedback. And every week on the Monday, I would say, who's the coordinator this week and who's presenting this week? And this particular team member held back. And then finally she said, I know, it's my turn. I have to present. And she didn't have that self-confidence, and yet she was the one that delivered the full pitch at the end, which was very well received.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that story. Absolutely love it. Thank you. Thank you, Cherie, for sharing that and for sharing that story. I think it speaks volumes about the opportunity for people to unleash, the potential of their teams, their people, the individuals. I would like to, actually, I'm going to ask you first, if people would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, they're very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Cherie Mylordis on LinkedIn, and I post regularly with my thought leadership and my insights. So there's always things coming there. You can also connect with me via my website. So there is a contact page on my website, which is nextgenify.com. And if you're interested in exploring more about the Academy, then you can go to nextgenifyacademy.com.
Brilliant. We'll include all of those links. I have a final question, which I'm going to ask you to answer and close out the interview. But before that, I just want to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share?
I think right now there's a lot of fear and uncertainty in the workforce. And I'm seeing a lot of this also at that younger level, where the professionals that have been in the workforce for maybe 5 years are feeling like, is this what I've got to look forward to? Is this the world of work? I studied this particular field and I felt like I was going to come in and make a difference, and it feels more distant than ever right now. I would just like to reassure people that, really, if you can lean into what you care about and understand your strengths, it will go a long way to help you with what to focus on. What do you love? What are you good at? And inside the Academy, I have programs that enable you to discover that. So, but, I'm not saying you must go into the Academy, but I'm just saying really reflect on what you love, what matters to you, and what are you good at. And if there's ways that you can bring that to your work, you can create a shift from right where you are. So you don't need a title to be a leader, and you can actually create a shift by small intentional steps from where you are. Even if you have a more bureaucratic organization, maybe you're feeling micromanaged, or maybe you're feeling like it's very difficult for your ideas to be shared, there are simple techniques you can use to create that shift. And so don't lose hope. And please connect with me, reach out to me if there's something you're grappling with. I would love to hear from you. But there are ways that you can make a difference from where you are, regardless of your role or title. So don't give up.
That's a really important message. Thank you for sharing that.
You're
so
welcome.
I'm going to ask you to close out the show with the response to this question about the future. So if we look 5 years down the track, who knows what the world is going to look like 5 years down the track? But let's channel our greatest optimism and imagine that you could achieve your absolute dream. What would that look like?
Well, I think I have to be true to what I'm advising organizations in, telling them that, come up with a really bold, audacious purpose that almost feels impossible, but it's worth striving for. So my big audacious goal is that work in 3D becomes a global movement, and that work in 3D is the expectation, not the exception. Because just imagine if organizations were able to hold up a neon sign and say, we work in 3D, we dare to go after a bold purpose. We're up for ditching anything that doesn't serve us, and we're up for you to contribute that. And we're up for dialing up better ways of leading and working. That is an aspiring set of conditions that potentially would attract ambitious people and give them hope for a career path, give them hope for learning. So if that was a known phrase or a known way of looking for particular traits of organizations that you might want to work for, then, imagine if that became the norm, not the exception. And imagine if that meant that people don't want to work for organizations that don't work in 3D. So those dinosaurs will become extinct. So that's my dream.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the For Love and Money podcast. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the purpose movement, visit us at thecauseeffect.com.au. And remember, doing good is good for business. So if you're not doing good, then what are you doing?